Welcome back, everybody, to another Python video. In today's video, we're going to continue our discussion on the PYODBC library. Previous videos, we talked about how to work with SQL servers and Excel files. So now I am moving on to Access Database. A lot of the stuff is going to be almost identical, but I am dedicating this video to kind of go a little bit more in depth behind the actual library itself. So just understanding certain functions that we can call that will return information, how we can sometimes customize our queries so that way it returns certain information by default, just little things like that. So that way you're aware that, hey, I need to access this information. Where would I access it from? That's basically what we're going to be covering in today's video. Okay, so first things first, obviously we're going to import our PyODBC library. I'm going to insert a cell right above, and we're going to talk about one of the first things that we should always do. So, if you're ever really curious and say like, hey, what's this library all about? You can always call the help function and then pass through the actual library itself. And this will give you a nice description about basically all the class objects, the description, a name for this library, just a lot of different information about the actual library itself. So that way, if you want to understand more about the inner workings of it, you can go to this help string and it will actually kind of walk you through some questions that you might have. So one of the first things you'll notice is the classes. So there's a lot of built-in exceptions that are related to the database itself. Things like data error, integrity error. This might be something where you're trying to insert a duplicate value into a table that might not allow for it. So that would be an integrity error. There might be a data error where there's something related to the data type. So, you're taking Python data types and you're putting them into an SQL database. Doesn't always work as nice as you would think it would be. And if you keep going down, they go through some of the other class objects. Big one is obviously your connection. This is how we connect to our different types of databases. And they talk about the different kinds of methods that belong to it. So we've seen cursor, commit, if we want to commit our changes, execute, so if we want to execute a query. We can do get info. We'll go through some of them, not necessarily all of them, but again, there is stuff in here where you can obviously make things pretty specific. These are kind of the properties and things like that. So this is things like max write, auto commit, timeout. These are things that you can specify if you want. So that way, if you don't want the default one, you can specify how you want it in your own little script. There's also the cursor object. And if you keep going down, there's all sorts of other stuff. We'll talk about foreign keys, getting columns, tables, things along that nature. But a lot of good stuff. And then I think there's one more that I kind of want to talk about. Data errors, I already kind of mentioned that. That's just the different types of particular errors that you might be coming across. Each one is its own class object, so each error is its own class object. And there's definitely a bunch of them. That's good though. I mean, you rather have more specific ones than not. We'll see there's actually a row object. This is where if we actually do a fetch one, it's considered a row object. And then warnings, things like that. So pretty useful stuff. So that's, again, just for you guys to know. If you ever are curious about this particular library, you can always call the help function. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is data sources. So this was something I actually didn't realize until I read the documentation. There's a data source function that if we run this, it's really neat because it gives us a dictionary with the types of files that we can basically pass through. So like a database file, an Excel file, Microsoft Access database. And so basically what you can do is you can leverage this dictionary to get the driver that you need in order to make a connection string. And so, again, I'm not saying this is the way you necessarily want to do it, but it's good to know it's there just in case. I was a little surprised there was only 3. I think it has to do something, maybe as you use them, it'll store them in that data sources one. I'm not positive, but I was a little surprised that only 3 came back because I'm pretty sure that it should be able to connect to other files that aren't necessarily, Excel files or, Microsoft Access databases and things like that. So I'll show you an example of how we can use this data source function in order to get our driver. Okay. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to connect to an Access database. We're going to obviously be using the Microsoft Access driver. And if you've seen my previous videos, I show you how to go and get the actual driver itself. So if you're curious, you can always just watch the Excel one or the SQL one. Otherwise, I'm also going to show you how to do it using the data sources one. And then with our particular connection string, we have to pass through the location of our access database. So this is just simply a file path to that particular access database. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to define those two, but I'm also going to show you how to do it with the data source function. So using the data source function is what we can do. So we'll say my data sources equals PYODBC data sources. And then just like that, we should be good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a new variable called access driver. And that's going to equal my data sources. And then I'm going to go into the MS access database. And just so you believe me, you will see this is the Microsoft Access driver database. So this is exactly the same as what we're seeing up here. So pretty useful. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to actually create our connection string. This is something I also learned that was new. We can actually pass through keywords for the actual items up here. So this will make the connection string a little bit cleaner and then also give you the flexibility where if you want to define your own variables to basically use that connection string, you can do that separately and it's not going to become a hassle when you have to, combine all the parts together. So we'll create a connection string to the database. And what we'll do is we'll create a new variable called connection PYODBC. We'll call the connect method. And then this is the cool part. So normally what we've seen in the past is that you would do driver and then you would pass through this one. In fact, I have my Excel one. I'll just show you what it looks like there. But remember this one where we had to make it all look fancy and it was basically a single string? Well, I found out that we can actually use Python keywords, or we can actually just use keywords and then assign that actual value to it. So it's kind of nice because it does give us some flexibility if we so choose. Really, all the parameter is the name that you see in the connection string. So you'll have one for driver, one for DBQ, and for access, that's actually the only two we need. So depending on the data source that you're connecting to, you might have more than two parameters. You might have 3 or 4 in some cases. It really just depends. But what I need to do here is I'm going to specify my driver and my DBQ. And the DBQ is just simply the file path. There is also an optional parameter that I can set. It's auto commit. So that means if I was to, make an execute that inserts, it would just auto commit, things along that nature. So that's optional. We're not going to be inserting any data in this particular video, but it's good to know that it is there. And what we'll do is we'll now take and create a cursor object, which is simply our connection, and then grabbing the cursor object that exists in it. So as you notice, there were no errors connecting to it. So there was nothing that came back and was creating potentially an issue. Notice too that I also used the access driver that I defined up here. So again, just so you see it, nothing really changed. I just changed it to driver, which was up here. So again, it's up to you how you want to approach it. I'm not here to say one way is better than the other. I'm just saying there's multiple ways to do the same thing. So something I might also be curious in is all the tables in my particular database, right? So I'll grab all the tables and so I'll put it into a list. And so we'll do list and I'll call my cursor object. And then there's a tables function that will return all the tables. And you'll notice there's a bunch of information here. So I believe a lot of them are kind of just internal ones, as you can tell. The ones that I'm kind of working with are right down here. You'll notice there's a couple different tables. It defines what it is. So it's a table. You could have a system table if it's a more internal one. You have a location to the database where the table is. And that's really it for the most part. It doesn't really give you a lot of information back, but it is there in case you just want a quick and easy way to get all the tables for a particular database. So what we're going to do next is I'm actually going to query one particular table in my database to show how that looks. So we will define the components of our query. We're going to need a table, obviously. And so we'll do table name equals, and mine is called actuals underscore expense. And from here, I'm going to define a query. So define a query, and we'll store it in a variable called query. All right, and so we'll do select star, so all columns from, and I'll put my little placeholder right there. I'll call my format function, and then I'll pass through my table name. So that will basically insert this little guy right here into that little placeholder. So a very simple query, nothing complex at this point. We're just simply doing something pretty simple. So we'll execute the query. What we'll do is we'll call our cursor object. There is an execute method, and then we pass through the query that we want to execute. And once we've done that, we see that we get a cursor object back. This is basically the results of our query. And if we want to, we can start accessing different components from that particular query. So let's just fetch a single row. So fetch a single row. And so we'll define one row as being the cursor object after we call fetch one. Fetch one. And now from here, what you'll notice, at least you'll notice, is it returns a single row of data. And a little bit misleading because it makes it look like it's a tuple. It is technically a row object. And to kind of show you that, you'll see right here, it is a PYODBC row object. With the row object, we can access individual elements of our particular row, in a sense. So individual columns. So if we want to access individual columns, we can either do it by indexing or we can pass through the column name. And so we'll do display one row, and then we'll slice it to get the first element. I have a particular column in there called CER, and it's all uppercase. And you'll notice that each one of these still returns a valid component. If it has spaces in the name, you would just put an underscore where the space is. So it does allow for spaces. Unfortunately, none of my columns in my table allow for spaces because I didn't write it like that, but it does allow for spaces. So it's kind of up to you, again, how you want to approach it. Me personally, I remember names better than I remember positions, and so I just like that one. Okay, so what if we wanted to fetch more than one? Well, we could do a fetch many. Fetch many will allow us to fetch as many rows as we want. So fetch many, and in this case, we will do 5. So this is where you can come in and you can specify to the cursor object how many rows you want back. And so in this case, I want 5. And so it returned 5. Now, keep in mind, you might be going, well, Alex, it started at 5. It's because I had already called it a couple times up here. And because of that, it was actually, it's just kind of iterating through that record set. So that's kind of the challenges with this sometimes is it does iterate one by one. And so if you're not careful, it can kind of get sometimes confusing. So just keep that in mind. Okay, and then I do want to talk about some properties of our cursor object. There is something called row count. What this property mentions is the number of rows that were updated. So if you were to pass through a query where you were updating 50 rows of data or something like that, you could call the row count property to see how many of your rows were actually updated. So -1 means that basically no rows were updated because we didn't pass through anything. And so just keep that one in mind. So again, it's going to come back -1 because we didn't actually update any rows in our particular situation. All right, next thing we're going to talk about is the array size property. So with the array size property, what this one allows us to do is we can change the default fetch many. And so by default, fetch many will always return 1 unless, again, we specify up here how many we want to return back to us. But we can change the array size property to where when we call fetch money, we don't necessarily have to pass through anything. We can just change the default setting. And so this is kind of just a read-write property. So again, it allows us to change the fetch many. So right now, by default, you'll see it's set to 1. Well, I might want to change that. Change the array size to 10. And so if I call my cursor.array size, I can set that equal to 10. And then run a fetch many. And so we'll say cursor.fetch many. You'll notice it returns 10 at a time. So I didn't pass through anything. I changed the default behavior of the fetch many function. So again, it is nice to know that exists in case you are curious how it works. Next thing we're going to talk about is the columns function. So this is where we can return all the columns for a particular table. Now in our situation, we called the, what did we call? Expense actuals or something like that. And so what we can do is get some details about the columns on the table we queried. And so we'll do columns list equals list. We'll call our cursor object, and then we'll call our columns function. And then I'll just show you, I guess, all the columns. Okay. So you can see there's obviously a ton of different columns in here. Some are more useful than others. And there's also a lot of information about what is in that particular tuple. I did get a little list for you guys where if you're curious and you're saying, hey, what does each element mean? I will be providing this in the Jupyter notebook. And it's also in the help document string as well too. But basically, it defines the table. You can do things like ordinal position, is nullable, things along that nature. So sometimes it seems like the data is not necessarily correct, or it's like in the wrong order, but supposedly each one of these pieces of information is supposed to be in here. So there's things like data types, column name, things like that. That's the enumerator, the type name, column size, buffer length, just all sorts of different stuff. Again, it's good to know that if you need to access it, it's right there. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about is statistics. So we can actually get some statistics about our particular table. I did do it. It didn't seem to provide much information. I'll show you what I mean. And so we'll say for item in list cursor statistics and then table name. So you do have to pass through a table name. It doesn't necessarily have to be the one that you're currently on in your cursor, but it is there. With this one, you get a particular name about that table, and then you get a bunch of stuff about it. But it seems to be, for the most part, kind of repetitive, but kind of not. I think this is the number of rows in it, and then there's some other information about, where is it, like kind of the cardinality and things along that nature. Again, I haven't really found a use for where I would use it yet, but again, it's there, I guess, if you want to kind of get these like little summaries about a particular table, like the number of rows or something along that nature. There's also foreign keys and primary keys. And so, for example, foreign key list equals list cursor and then foreign keys. Unfortunately, I don't have any foreign keys in my particular table, so it's going to come back with nothing. But basically what it's going to return back to you is a list of your foreign keys, and then naturally, because there is a foreign key, there is also a primary keys and things along that nature. So again, it kind of just depends what you're trying to do. But you can tell here again, I don't have really any primary keys as well. But if you wanted to access the primary keys, this is how you would do it. There's also a get type info. So this is where if you want to get, for example, the data types that are available in this particular library, this is where you would get it. So it'd be get type info. And then I'm converting it to a list because there's a bunch back. But you can see there's GUID, long char, varchar, currency, integer, small int. I don't think there's big int or anything like that. Integer, counter. So these are all the data types that we basically have access to and that we can also play with. So this is, again, if you just want to know more of the inner workings behind it, this is where you would get it from. Sometimes you do have to read the documentation along with it and kind of understand what they're necessarily looking at, but sometimes just accessing the information is already hard enough. But with that being said, that actually finishes the video. So if you have any questions about what we covered In this particular video, so working with access and kind of the different topics we covered, please make sure to put them down in the comments below and I will try to get back to you. Also, if you could, please make sure to like the video. We always appreciate the support. And if you're not already, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and continue watching some videos. Hopefully you guys are finding it interesting. I am planning to release a pivot table for the JavaScript API probably tomorrow. I'm hoping so. It was, again, a busy first couple days this week. Home inspection was this week and all that kind of fun stuff. So, but it's getting close to being finished, which I'm very happy about. So yeah, thanks again for watching, everybody. We will see you in the next video.